The broadcasts started at 0300. Not because anyone chose that hour, but because Brainiac's arrival didn't operate on schedules. The ships had entered low orbit sometime between midnight and the first automated alert, and by the time the regime's communications grid registered the anomaly, 3 city blocks in Metropolis's eastern corridor had already been encased, lifted cleanly from the ground, and suspended in containment spheres that glowed with an amber light no engineer could identify. The buildings didn't collapse. They didn't burn. They simply stopped belonging to the planet. By 0400, the emergency broadcast had looped 47 times. Every screen in Metropolis displayed the same white-on-blue text: Regime security alert, extraterrestrial incursion, remain indoors, comply with all security directives. The low-A speakers mounted on government buildings repeated it every 90 seconds in English, then Spanish, then a synthesized tone that was supposed to communicate calm, but didn't. On street-level compliance looked like this: curtains-drawn lights off families pressed against interior walls, listening to the sound of something enormous moving through the sky. The people who had lived under the regime long enough knew that staying visible during a crisis was its own kind of risk. The ones who had arrived in Metropolis in the past 2 years, refugees from cities the regime had already restructured, knew it from experience. The eastern checkpoint had been shut down 4 hours ago. The patrol unit stationed along the harbor road had pulled back to the inner defensive perimeter. That withdrawal wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. When the regime's armored units moved away from a position, the people living near that position understood they had been reclassified not as civilians to be protected, but as a buffer zone. None of this appeared on the broadcast. Sud, in the sub-level of a building that had been a parking structure in a previous administration and was now a regime communications relay, 2 technicians watched a secondary monitor displaying seismic and atmospheric readings. The primary feed was showing the containment spheres, Brainiac's work, clean and methodical, collecting the city the way a researcher collects specimens. One technician had been running the same diagnostic loop for an hour because she didn't know what else to do. The other had stopped pretending to work. He was watching the sphere over Block 41, where he knew his brother's apartment building stood, and calculating whether the amber glow meant preservation or something else entirely. Neither of them spoke. The relay stations uplinked to Regime High Command had been silent for 11 minutes. That was unusual. Command went quiet when it was receiving something it hadn't processed yet, which usually meant either a decision was being made or one had already been made, and the people below the decision were about to learn about it after the fact. 430 miles above the eastern seaboard, Brainiac's primary processing array was sorting through 40 years of Metropolis data. Architectural schematics, traffic patterns, population density by city block. Water table depth, soil composition, 17 years of regime broadcast logs. The collection wasn't random. It was taxonomic. The ship's hull bore no markings that a human database could cross-reference. It was not the vessel of a conqueror, but of an archivist, which made it, depending on your perspective, considerably more dangerous. The 12 containment spheres currently in transit represented a single test run, a proof of method. The actual collection hadn't begun. The spatial distortion created by the extraction process wasn't a side effect. It was a function. Each sphere's removal left a localized tear in atmospheric cohesion. Brief self-sealing, structurally insignificant to the ship's primary operations. Brainiac's array logged these tears as routine debris and moved on. One of them didn't seal correctly. The array flagged it at 0417 as a variance of 0.003% from baseline. Within the acceptable margin, the log entry closed automatically. In a chamber that Kent Nelson had not chosen and could not leave the helm of Nabu, sat like a second skull over his head, and he was not entirely the one wearing it. He had been Kent for approximately 4 minutes this hour. The hours before that belonged to Nabu, to the Lords of Order, and their calculus of acceptable outcomes. Nabu's reasoning was not cruel. That was the part Kent had taken years to understand, and understanding it hadn't made it easier. Nabu did not weigh lives the way a person weighed lives. He weighed configurations. The configuration in which Brainiac collected Metropolis and moved on was, according to Nabu's analysis, preferable to the configurations in which intervention produced a longer-term disruption to order. Kent disagreed. He had 4 minutes to disagree with it. He had been a sorcerer for most of his adult life. He understood that power flowed through channels, and that forcing power through a channel it wasn't designed for caused damage to the channel. He also understood that there were moments when you damaged the channel deliberately, because the alternative was to become someone who watched and calculated while a city was filed away into amber. The spatial tear from Block 41's extraction was already self-sealing. He could feel it the way you feel a door closing across a large room, not loud, but final. He reached through the remnant of it with every degree of precision he had, and he did not open a gate because he didn't have enough of himself left to open a gate. He sent a signal. One pulse, compressed directional, aimed at whatever lay on the other side of that vanishing seam between configurations. And he put into that signal every piece of information he could compress in 4 minutes: the shape of the threat, the nature of the place, the fact that something here was ending and had not yet finished ending. Then Nabu came back. Kent said nothing more. There was nothing to say, and no one left to say it to. The pulse moved through the tear at the exact moment the tear finished closing. A fraction of a second in either direction, and it would have gone nowhere. What it found on the other side was not, by the standards of either universe, a door. It was less than that. A seam's shadow. A place where something had been that wasn't anymore. The pulse arrived anyway. The tear registered on the regime's atmospheric sensors as a Category 3 spatial anomaly, which was the system's polite language for something it had no reference for. The alert generated a ticket. The ticket entered a queue. The queue was being processed by a system already handling 217 active alerts from the Brainiac incursion, and the spatial anomaly ticket sat at position 194. It would never be processed. At 0431, in the eastern corridor, 2 blocks from the nearest containment sphere, the air opened. Not like an explosion. Not like a tear in fabric, which is what the regime's after-action report would later describe it as, because that was the closest analogy that the report's authors could locate. It was more precise than that. A section of the air, perhaps 10 feet across, perhaps less, simply rearranged itself into a different kind of space. There was no light from it, no sound, except a pressure change that made the pigeons on the adjacent rooftop lift all at once and not come back. What stepped through was large, broad across the chest and shoulders in the way that suggested not just size, but density, the sense that the space a body occupied had been filled more completely than human bodies filled it. The uniform was red and black, fitted close, bearing no insignia regime database could identify. The mustache was white and full. The ears slightly elongated at the tip, the eyes a clear amber that caught the orange glow of the nearest containment sphere without reflecting much. He stood still for a long moment. Not the stillness of confusion. Not the stillness of a man taking in an unfamiliar environment and calculating his options. Something quieter than that, the stillness of a thing that has no threat to calibrate against. He looked at the containment sphere floating above Block 41. He looked at the broadcast text, still cycling on the screen, mounted to the building across the street. He looked at the patrol unit that had until 30 seconds ago been moving along the far end of the block and was now stopped. The 2 regime soldiers in that unit had their weapons raised. Standard protocol for unclassified intrusion events. Their training was solid. Their hands were steady. Neither of them moved. He didn't look at them for long. He looked at the sphere. "How many?" he said. His voice carried without effort, the way a large room carries sound differently than a small one. The soldiers didn't answer. One of them activated his comm unit and began a report in a low, flat voice. Unidentified individual, Eastern Corridor, Subsection 7, physical description, the large man, had already stopped listening. He turned his attention to the sky, tracking the geometry of the other containment spheres, with the patience of someone running a calculation he had run many times before in different forms. 11 spheres, 12 counting the one above Block 41. The ship was visible if you knew what you were looking at, a mass that occluded stars in a pattern too regular to be weather. He had seen this method before. Not this specific iteration, but the category it belonged to. Something that moved through inhabited space and took what it wanted, because nothing in that space had ever provided a reason not to. He turned toward the ship. One problem at a time. To no one in particular. The comm unit crackled. The soldier's report was reaching the relay station now. The technician who had stopped working an hour ago stared at the physical description coming through his earpiece and tried to make it fit anything in the regime's threat database. It didn't fit. He flagged it as Priority 1 unknown and sent it up the chain. 11 minutes later, the first report reached a desk where someone with enough clearance to be alarmed would read it and, after a brief silence, pass it to someone else, with orders to figure out what that thing in the Eastern Corridor was, where it had come from, and whether they could contain it before the situation got more complicated than it already was. By then, Topo was already at the edge of the atmosphere. He hadn't run. He hadn't flown in any theatrical sense. He had simply moved at a pace that the regime's remaining sensor arrays in the Eastern Corridor would later clock at and then stop clocking, because the number it produced didn't fit the field the sensor array used to log numbers like that. The sky above the containment spheres was cold and clear. He could feel the ship's mass from here. He could feel the spatial architecture of what it was doing, the systematic geometry of removal, precise and patient. He could feel at the outermost edge of what he was paying attention to the city below him. The curtained windows, the looped broadcast, the silence of people waiting to find out what happened next. One problem at a time. He noted the ship's primary processing cluster, not because the ship had labeled it, but because a structure that complex had to route its attention somewhere, and structures that routed attention always had a center. He identified it in approximately 4 seconds. He moved toward it at a pace that could be described as unhurried, because hurry implied the possibility of being too late, and he had not assessed the situation as one that required him to hurry. The signal that Kent Nelson had sent, compressed directional, aimed at a closing seam, had contained a great deal of information about the shape of the threat. It had also at its core contained something simpler than information. A location, a situation. The kind of moment that functions as a request without using the word. Toppo had read it the way it was intended and come through anyway. What he did next would take approximately 40 seconds. 40 seconds was longer than it needed to be. The ship's processing array registered the intrusion at the 2-second mark, not as a threat, because threat was a category that required recognizing something as capable of causing harm. And the array had no reference architecture for what was currently moving through its outer hull. It registered it instead as an anomaly, then as a cascading anomaly, then as a cascading anomaly propagating faster than the containment protocols were designed to address. The array's logs showed 11 distinct attempts to reclassify the event before the logs stopped being written. At the 17-second mark, Topo reached the primary coordination node. He didn't destroy it. Destruction was imprecise debris, shock waves, secondary fragmentation, the kind of consequence that traveled sideways and hit things that weren't the target. He pressed one hand against the node's housing and pushed the energy of destruction through it in a single directed pulse, the way you press a finger against a candle flame, to end it, rather than blow the whole candle across the room. The housing didn't crack. It didn't explode. The material simply stopped being organized in the way that made it functional at the molecular level silently, in the span of a breath. The 12 containment spheres descended. Not crashed. Descended slowly, as if the system releasing them had retained enough residual logic to complete the retrieval sequence before losing all coherence. The buildings inside the spheres were intact. The structural damage was minimal. Below on the eastern corridor, people who had pressed themselves against interior walls for 3 hours heard the amber light outside their windows change quality and didn't move yet because they had learned that in this city, things ending was not the same as things being safe. At the 31-second mark, Toppo located the ship's autonomous defense array, a secondary system hardwired and isolated from the primary node, designed to operate independently of any central command. It wasn't intelligent. It didn't react to the primary node's failure with grief or urgency. It simply registered a threshold event, an entity capable of destroying its command architecture, and armed itself in response the way a lock springs when a door opens too fast. It would sit armed until something gave it a target. Given time and opportunity, it would find one. Toppo noted it. He did not disarm it. He turned and descended. At 0513, every screen in Metropolis went dark for 11 seconds. Then they came back, not with the emergency broadcast, but with a different frame, white background, blue seal. A man in a suit rather than the automated text loop. The voice was measured, authoritative. The kind of voice that had been trained to sound like the situation was already being managed. Citizens of Metropolis, the extraterrestrial incursion has been neutralized. The regime, in coordination with its security apparatus, has successfully prevented the collection of our city and our people. The containment zones are being released. You may return to normal movement protocols within the hour. A pause. Calibrated. However, a secondary anomaly has been detected in the eastern corridor. An unidentified individual of extraterrestrial origin entered our atmosphere during the incursion. This individual's intentions and loyalties are unknown. Until classification is complete, the regime asks all citizens to report any sightings and to remain calm. We are monitoring the situation. The broadcast cut to the seal image and held. In the relay station sublevel, the technician who had been watching Block 41 sphere finally exhaled. His brother's building was intact. He watched the sphere settle back to ground level with a mechanical gentleness that seemed wrong for something that large. Then he watched the broadcast change and understood what the regime had just done. Not to Brainiac, who was already handled, but to the thing that had handled him. He said nothing. That was also something he had learned. Sir, in a building that didn't appear on any regime city registry, Bruce Wayne sat in front of a bank of monitors and watched 3 feeds simultaneously. The regime broadcast the atmospheric sensor logs from the eastern corridor and a shaky handheld recording someone had managed to get from a 3rd-floor window overlooking the sphere's descent. The recording lasted 19 seconds. It showed the spheres coming down, and it showed briefly at the upper right corner of the frame moving at a speed that turned it into a smear of red-black against the pre-dawn sky, something descending from orbit that was not a ship and not a falling object. He ran the footage back twice. Then he set it aside. He didn't stop the ship. He looked at the room where two members of his network were sitting with tablets and the particular silence of people waiting to be told what to think. He stopped the operation. The ship is still up there. He left it. Neither of them answered because the statement wasn't a question. He also left something else. Wayne pulled up the sensor anomaly that his systems had flagged at the 31-second mark, a secondary energy signature aboard the vessel, distinct from the primary node's collapse, holding steady at a low activation state. Something armed, something that's still running. He studied it for a moment. He knows it's there. 7 miles away, in the sub-level of the regime's Eastern Operations Center, Clark Kent stood in front of a tactical display and processed two facts that did not fit together comfortably. The first, the incursion had been ended. Metropolis was intact. Every person who had been inside a containment sphere was going to walk out of it with no structural injuries. By any metric the regime used to measure success, this was a success. The second, he had not done it. Something he had never encountered. Something his sensors couldn't fully resolve, even now that it was standing on the ground, somewhere in his city, had walked through his atmosphere, located the most critical point of Brainiac's operation, and shut it down in less time than it took a standard regime patrol unit to respond to a level 1 alert. He had felt it. The power signature, not precisely, because nothing in his experience gave him a reference to be precise against. But the shape of it, the weight. It wasn't unfamiliar in quality. It was unfamiliar in magnitude. Like recognizing what a fire is and then encountering one that is also the sun. I want the eastern corridor locked. Full perimeter. Nobody moves in or out until I've spoken to it. The officer beside him opened his mouth and then closed it because the word "it" had answered the question he was about to ask about how to classify the entity in the regime system. It's not an ally. Kent read the pause correctly. It handled the problem. That doesn't make it an ally. Toppo stood at street level in the eastern corridor, a block from where the nearest sphere had settled. A small group of people were visible at the far end, not moving toward the sphere, not moving away from it, just standing in the particular suspended state of people who don't yet know whether they're allowed to feel relieved. A child had pressed its face against a ground floor window and was staring at him with the direct, uncomplicated attention of someone who hasn't yet learned that staring at large, unfamiliar things is a risk. He looked back at it briefly. Around him, the physical evidence of the incursion was everywhere. Scorch marks in the pavement, where the sphere's anchoring field had made contact, a fine particulate residue that was probably processing byproduct from Brainiac's collection system, the structural stress fractures in two adjacent facades from the pressure differential during extraction. None of this damage was his. All of it would need addressing. A regime patrol unit rounded the corner at the east end of the block. Then another. They held their positions at distance, weapons trained. A third unit appeared on the roof of the building to his left. He counted 12 armed personnel in under 4 seconds, noted the positioning, noted the sight lines, and returned his attention to the dispersing particulate in the air. How many people were inside the spheres? He said. His voice was level, aimed at no one in particular, but carrying well enough that the patrol unit at the east end could hear it clearly. No one answered. I'll ask the other one. He was not looking at the patrol units when he said it. He was looking at the rooftop line to the north, where a figure in gray and black was positioned just below the sight angle of the regime unit on the adjacent building, visible to Topo, invisible to everyone else on the street. A beat of silence. Roughly 400. Batman from the rooftop. Not loudly. He'd calculated that Topo would hear it at that distance without difficulty. Across all 12 spheres. Were any harmed during descent? Not yet confirmed. Initial readings suggest no structural casualties. Toppo processed this the way he processed tactical data, briefly, completely, and without visible reaction. Then, "Where is the man in the yellow helmet?" Another pause. Different in quality from the first not tactical assessment, but something closer to the particular silence of someone deciding how much of what they know to share with someone they haven't classified yet. Unavailable. Topo accepted this. He turned to face the eastern end of the block, where the regime's patrol units were maintaining their positions with the rigid discipline of people following an order they weren't sure about. "Tell your commanders I require a meeting." Both factions, one location, within the hour. "You're not in a position to set terms," a voice said through the patrol unit's external speaker. The voice of someone transmitting from a distance, authorizing a response. Topo looked at the speaker. "I just ended your incursion in 40 seconds. I left the ship intact because I chose to. There is a secondary defense system aboard that vessel that is currently armed and waiting for a target." He let that settle for 2 seconds. "I have not given it one." "Sotas," the speaker went quiet. 1 hour. "I will not ask again." He turned away from the patrol units and looked at the settled sphere. The cracked pavement, the window with the child still pressed against it. He looked at the city that had survived the night by a margin it didn't yet understand, held intact by a decision he'd made at the 31-second mark that had nothing to do with any of them. That decision would need revisiting. He filed it, where he filed things that were not finished. Behind him, the regime broadcast had already shifted framing for the second time that hour. The suited voice was speaking again, and the language had changed in the way language changes when a government needs a new emergency to replace the one that just resolved itself. The word neutralized had been replaced. The word unknown appeared 3 times in 40 seconds. The word threat appeared twice. Batman's voice came from the rooftop again, quieter now, not intended for the patrol units. "You understand they're already building a case against you?" "Yes." "That doesn't concern you." "What concerns me," he turned back to the street, "is who built the cages, and whether they built them before or after they ran out of other ideas." He waited in the corridor as the sky above Metropolis shifted from black to a pale industrial gray. The sun arriving on a city that looked exactly like a city that had survived something it hadn't expected to survive intact on the surface. With all the real damage still pending, still working its way through the infrastructure of every decision that had brought it here. The regime's deadline for the meeting wasn't going to come from the regime. It was going to come from him. The location was Batman's choice, which meant it was a compromise that satisfied no one and could be defended to anyone. A decommissioned transit authority substation 3 levels below the financial district. No windows, 2 entry points, one of which the regime's advance team had sealed before Batman's people finished sweeping it. The walls were raw concrete, the lighting a series of portable work lamps someone had bolted to the ceiling crossbeams. A folding table stood at the center of the floor. Nobody sat at it. There were 14 regime soldiers along the north wall. Batman had 4 people he trusted positioned in the access tunnels. Both sides knew about the other. Neither mentioned it. The geometry of the room made clear that the soldiers were not there to protect Superman, and Batman's people were not there to protect Batman. They were there because everyone present had agreed on some level that they needed a way out if the meeting went wrong, and because having a way out made it possible to walk in. Topo arrived 90 seconds before the deadline. He came through the eastern access point, which had not been listed on the regime's security assessment, and stood at the edge of the lamplight without announcing himself. The soldiers along the north wall shifted their weight. Superman, who had been standing with his arms crossed near the table, looked up, Batman, positioned with his back to the south wall where he could see every corner of the room, did not move at all. "You're early." "You expected delay." He walked to the table and stopped on one side of it. He didn't sit. He looked at the folding table for a moment, with the expression of someone noting that the staging of a room reveals the assumptions of the people who staged it. "Sit-down negotiations." "You were hoping for a longer process." "I was hoping for a functional one." Superman stepped forward. In the substation's flat work lamp light, the blue of his suit read almost gray, and the red of his cape was the color of old brick. He looked like what he was, someone who had been exercising authority for long enough that the posture of it had become the posture of his body. "You shut down an extraterrestrial incursion without authorization or coordination. That makes you an unknown variable operating inside our atmosphere. Until we understand what you are and what you want, you're a threat. You lost 400 people to Brainiac's first collection run. How many in the second if I had waited for authorization? That's not the point. That is exactly the point." Toppo's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You define threat by what you can't control. The incursion was a threat you couldn't end. I ended it. Now I'm the threat. This is not a new pattern." Superman's jaw tightened. He said nothing because there was no good answer to it, and he was not a man who gave bad answers when good ones weren't available. Batman said from the wall, "What do you want?" "What I want is not the operative question." Topo turned his attention across the room, taking in both of them in a single unhurried sweep. "The operative question is what this situation requires, which is why I called this meeting rather than resolving the situation unilaterally." "And what does the situation require, Batman asked. "A demonstration that this city is capable of governing itself without the infrastructure of fear that's currently holding it together." Topo placed both hands flat on the table. His hands were very large. The table did not shift under the pressure. But something in the room did some quality of the air, or the particular attention of the 14 soldiers along the north wall, who had all become very still. "I have 3 conditions. They are not negotiable, and they are time-limited. I will tell you once." Nobody told him to continue or told him to stop. The silence was its own form of attention. "First, the regime releases all individuals currently detained under preventive security protocols, the classification your administration uses when you want to hold someone without charging them. I want them processed and released within 2 hours. Not transferred, released." Superman said, "That's a security risk. It's a legal obligation. Call it what it is. Second," he didn't pause for a response, "the insurgency stands down every active operation with a casualty radius above single digits. That includes whatever Batman has currently staged in the 3 locations his people visited in the past 6 hours. He looked at Batman when he said this. Batman's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. "I'm not asking you to disarm. I'm asking you to stop pointing weapons at crowds." The silence in the room recalibrated. "You've been watching us." His voice was carefully neutral. "I've been here for less than 2 hours. You've been building towards something catastrophic for years. It wasn't difficult to read." Batman said nothing. The 4 people in the access tunnels said nothing. The soldiers on the north wall said nothing. The substation hummed with the particular frequency of old electrical infrastructure that had been dormant for a long time and was now in the presence of too many people with too much at stake beginning to feel the current again. Third, Topo straightened. Both factions designate a point of verification, 1 representative each with direct access to operational decisions, not advisory, direct. They will report to the man in the yellow helmet who will serve as the holding mechanism for any agreement reached today. Fate is, Batman started. I know his situation. That is why I'm naming him. He is the only party in this room not currently invested in the outcome. Superman moved. Not toward Toppo, he moved toward the table, which was a different kind of motion. The motion of someone repositioning themselves relative to a situation that had just shifted in a way they hadn't fully mapped. You're asking us to hand authority to a third party based on your assessment of who's trustworthy. I'm asking you to accept oversight, which is something every functioning system requires and which neither of you has submitted to in years. That is not an accusation. It's a description. Superman looked at him for a long moment. When Clark Kent had been young enough that the memory felt like someone else's, he had believed that power exercised with good intentions was sufficient. He had been corrected on this point repeatedly and had kept believing it anyway because the alternative required dismantling something he had built at a cost he couldn't revisit. That belief was in his face right now. Not as arrogance exactly, as a load-bearing wall. You have 2 hours, starting now. From the north wall, one of the regime soldiers, the one closest to the east, accessed the one whose hand had been drifting toward his sidearm for the past 3 minutes, made a decision. It wasn't a good decision, but it was a human one. He had been standing in a room where something he couldn't measure was talking to his commanding officer. Like his commanding officer had something to answer for. And at some point, the body makes a choice that the mind has been avoiding. He drew. Topo did not look at him. He extended one hand to his left palm open, and the soldier's weapon stopped moving. Not because Topo caught it, because the space between the weapon and any further motion simply became for approximately 2 seconds a place where motion in that direction was not available. Then Topo closed his hand, and the weapon compressed into a shape roughly the size of a walnut, and he set it on the folding table without looking at it. The sound it made was very small. I'm not here to be tested. He addressed the room. I'm here because the alternative to this conversation is a much shorter one. Nobody on the north wall moved. Batman had not moved. Superman had not moved, which was of the three the one that required the most visible effort. We'll need time to verify the detainee numbers. Batman waited a moment that lasted precisely as long as it needed to. You have 2 hours. Verification is part of that. And if we don't meet your conditions... Topo picked up the compressed metal from the table and held it in his palm for a moment, not a gesture of threat, or not only that. More the gesture of someone who has just demonstrated the relevant principle and wants to make sure the demonstration was legible. Then he set it down again. Then you will have told me everything I need to know about whether this world is capable of choosing differently. He stepped back from the table. I'll be in the eastern corridor. Come find me when you've decided. He left through the eastern access point. The room held its silence for several seconds after he was gone, the way a room holds the shape of a thing that just passed through it. Superman was the first to speak. He's bluffing. About the secondary system, about the timeline. Batman looked at the compressed metal on the table. A regime-issue sidearm reduced to a shape the size of a walnut in the span of a reflex. Which part would you like to bet on? Superman had no answer for that either. He turned toward the north wall and began issuing quiet instructions to the soldiers. Organize a detainee review contact, legal processing get him numbers, and his voice was the same as it always was. Certain directed the voice of someone who had not yet admitted that the thing he was most afraid of in the room was not the man who had just left it. It was the 2 hours. And what happened when they ran out. The autonomous defense array found its target at 0741. Not because anyone pointed it there. It had been sitting armed in low orbit since Toppo left it, running the same targeting logic it had been built to run: identify threshold-level threats, assign priority, wait for a firing solution. When the regime's salvage unit approached the drifting vessel at 0738 in 2 unmarked extraction craft, no military designation, no broadcast ID, the kind of vehicles that don't appear on official logs, the array processed them against its parameters. 2 craft, non-Coluan in origin, conducting what its sensors read as an intrusion attempt on Brainiac's primary hardware. It fired once. A single precision strike, the kind of systems-level retaliation Brainiac had apparently designed for exactly this scenario. The first craft lost propulsion and went down in the harbor. The second pulled out of range in time. 11 people were in the water before the regime's harbor units could deploy. And by the time those units arrived, 4 were already being pulled out by civilian boats that had no business being there. People who had seen the flash from their windows and gone out anyway. Because Metropolis had a long history of its citizens doing things the regime preferred they didn't. 7 people were recovered. 4 required immediate medical treatment. Nobody died. That last fact was almost certainly not what the regime had planned for. By 0800, the broadcast had changed again. The regime's communications director stood in front of a blue backdrop bearing the regime's seal-clean frame, direct lighting the visual grammar of authority, announcing something serious but controlled. Her voice was the voice of someone reading language that had been drafted before the incident it was describing had fully concluded. At approximately 7:40 this morning, a hostile strike was conducted against a sanctioned regime security operation in Metropolis Harbor. The strike originated from an unidentified orbital weapon system. 12 regime personnel were targeted. The organization responsible has not claimed the attack, but this incident follows a pattern of coordinated destabilization that this administration has been monitoring since the arrival of the external hostile entity now operating within our city. She paused. 1 beat. The pause had been in the script. We want to be clear, the regime does not consider this a random event. We consider it an escalation. Our response will be proportional and immediate. The broadcast cut to the seal, held for 3 seconds, returned to the regular emergency information loop. In the transit substation where the meeting had been held less than 2 hours earlier, one of Batman's people pulled out an earpiece and set it on the concrete floor very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid of dropping. They sent an unmarked team to the ship. I know. To do what? He didn't answer, because the answer was one of several possibilities, and none of them were good. Either the regime had sent the team to recover Brainiac's technology, which was exactly the kind of decision that proved Toppo's point about what they did with every available resource. Or they had sent the team to stage a provocation they could attribute to someone else. Or both. The distinction mattered less than the result, which was the defense array had done exactly what it was designed to do. 4 people were in a hospital, and in 40 minutes, every regime broadcast in the city would be running the phrase, "external hostile entity," on a loop. Get the detainee numbers. I need to know if they're moving on the releases or stalling. She looked at him. You think they're stalling? I think they sent an unlisted team to an armed orbital platform 2 hours after agreeing to stand down. What do you think? She left. Batman stood alone in the substation and looked at the compressed metal still sitting on the folding table, which no one had moved. He had been doing this long enough, opposing things large enough, that he had developed a particular sense for the moment when a situation stopped being a problem and became a condition. A problem could be solved. A condition could only be managed or endured. He was looking at a condition. So, On the eastern side of the financial district, a secondary situation was unfolding along lines that had nothing to do with the harbor strike and everything to do with the 2 hours of tension that had preceded it. A regime checkpoint at the corner of Hobbs Street had been running accelerated processing since 0630, pulling people out of the morning movement corridor, checking credentials, occasionally detaining. The detentions had increased after the harbor strike. By 0815, there were 31 people held in the checkpoint staging area. Most of them held on the ambiguous authority of security review pending, which was a classification that could mean anything or nothing depending on who was processing the paperwork. One of them was 17 years old. She had been on her way to a medical facility 4 blocks away. She had her ID, her travel authorization, and a documentation packet from the facility confirming her appointment. The soldier reviewing her documents had been on duty for 11 hours and was receiving real-time updates through his earpiece about an orbital weapon strike on his colleagues in the harbor. And something in the combination of these things produced a decision that he would spend a long time thinking about afterward. He called for a supervisor. The supervisor was dealing with something else. The girl waited. After 40 minutes, a second soldier arrived and began the review again from the beginning. She missed her appointment. 2 blocks north, someone who had been watching the checkpoint for the past hour sent a message to a contact in the insurgency network. The message was 3 words and a location. It was not authorized by anyone in the insurgency's senior structure, but the person who received it was 23, had lost someone at a regime checkpoint 8 months ago, and made a decision. He wasn't stupid. He didn't fire a weapon. He released footage. 17 minutes of checkpoint footage, not from today, from 4 months ago, which was worse, showing exactly the kind of security review that the regime's communications director had just characterized as a sanctioned operation. Posted across every platform, the insurgency maintained simultaneously at 0831. By 0845, it had been seen by more people than the harbor strike broadcast. Topo had been standing on the roof of a 6-story building overlooking the checkpoint since 0807. He had watched the girl arrive. He had watched the credential review. He had watched the 40-minute wait and the second soldier beginning again from the beginning. He had not intervened. Not because he couldn't. Because the checkpoint as it stood was not a crisis, it was a policy. Policies were not ended by lifting one person out of a line. He had learned this about systems not on this world, but the knowledge transferred that the impulse to fix the visible instance of a wrong was often the thing that allowed the wrong to continue operating at scale unexamined, because the visible instance had been resolved and the pressure had been released. He watched. At 0833, the footage went live, and the checkpoint supervisor received an alert through his command channel. Topo watched the supervisor's posture change, the particular shift of someone who has just become aware that he is being observed and watched. The instruction come down clear. The staging area released the 31 people, do it quickly and without incident, and under no circumstances let any of it look like a response to the footage. It looked like a response to the footage. The girl with the medical documentation was released at 0841. She was 4 blocks from the facility. She walked quickly without looking back. Topo noted the sequence. The footage had done what his intervention couldn't have: created a cost for the policy rather than just a cost for one instance of it. He filed this under things that the insurgency had done correctly, which was a short list, but not an empty one. Then his attention moved to the harbor. The weapon system had armed again after the strike. It was still running its targeting parameters. The salvage team's second craft was holding at a distance, probably waiting for orders that nobody wanted to give, because the first set of orders had already produced 4 people in a hospital. The platform didn't care about their uncertainty. It was patient in the way that automated systems are patient absolutely without cost. He extended his awareness toward it, not touching it, just reading its current priority assignments. It had logged the second craft as a lower-level threat than the first team because the second craft had not attempted an intrusion. It was waiting for the intrusion attempt before it fired again. That gap would eventually close. He made a note of when. At 0912, Superman arrived at the regime's Eastern Operations Center and stood in front of a tactical map that had been updated 17 times since the harbor strike. The detainee release numbers were on the left side of the display. 43 people processed, 19 released, 24 still in review. The harbor strike status was on the right, 4 hospitalized stable. Second craft recalled. Orbital weapons still active. No clear attribution. The weapon fired on our people, the officer beside him said. The weapon fired on an unlisted craft, conducting an unlisted operation. Who authorized the harbor team? A pause that was its own answer. Find out. And get me the name of whoever cleared that operation, because right now, the only version of this story that doesn't end badly for us is the one where we didn't know. He looked at the detainee numbers. 19 out of 43. Why are 24 still in review? Legal processing. Move faster. It wasn't mercy. It was arithmetic. He had agreed to conditions he didn't intend to honor at full scale, and the gap between what he'd agreed to and what he'd done was a gap. The external hostile entity would be measuring with something considerably more precise than his legal processing team. He was not afraid of the entity. He was afraid of the math. By 1003 an hour before Toppo's deadline expired, the regime broadcast had shifted framing for the third time. The harbor strike was now being characterized as evidence of insurgency activity rather than an autonomous system response. The footage the insurgency had released was being described as selectively edited material of questionable provenance. The external hostile entity was still being called a threat. But the language had softened now of unknown intention rather than hostile, a shift in 2 words that meant something to the lawyers who would eventually write the historical record of this day. Batman's network intercepted all of it. He noted the softening. It didn't make him feel better. Regimes didn't soften language because they'd had a change of heart. They softened language when they were preparing for something that required a better paper trail. At 1021, one of his senior contacts sent a message. Someone in the network pushed the footage without authorization. I'm handling it. Batman looked at the message for a long time. Then he sent back 2 words. How old? The answer came back in under a minute 23. He set down the comm unit. 23, angry and right about every fact, while being catastrophically wrong about the timing. This was how it always worked. The regime didn't need to manufacture every crisis. It just needed to be ready when the people opposing it did it for them. At 158, Topo descended from the roof and walked to the center of the eastern corridor where the checkpoint had been 2 hours earlier and was now just a stretch of pavement with scuff marks where the staging barriers had been dragged away. He stood there for a moment, facing north, as the city moved around him with the cautious, eyes-forward momentum of people who had learned that open streets could become closed streets faster than a broadcast cycle. A figure landed 100 feet away. Blue suit, no cape Superman had left it at the operations center, which was the kind of detail that meant something if you knew how to read it. You knew the array would fire. I knew what it was designed to do. You sent people to it anyway. I didn't authorize that team. Someone in your structure did. Topo looked at him steadily. Your structure is yours. That's the point. Superman's expression held. He had been through enough in the past 4 years, enough grief, enough compromise, enough mornings. where the right thing and the necessary thing had been different things that his face had learned to hold under pressure. But something moved behind it now briefly that wasn't authority. The releases are at 60%. We'll hit the threshold. You have 37 minutes. We'll hit it. Toppo said nothing. He looked up at the sky, not at the ship, which wasn't visible in daylight, but in the direction of it, the way you look in the direction of a sound. You heard once and haven't heard again. Your people sent an unmarked team to an armed platform 2 hours after agreeing to stand down. Someone in your opposition released unauthorized footage 2 hours after agreeing to hold. Neither of those was an accident. Neither was a rogue action. He looked back at Superman. They were what your people do when the pressure comes off. Reflex, trained response, muscle memory from years of operating in a world where every resource is a weapon and every pause is a gap to exploit. Superman said nothing. That is what I'm looking at. Not the incidents, the reflexes. He turned and walked back the way he'd come. Superman watched him go with the expression of someone who has just been told something true, that they have no use for, not because it's wrong, but because being right about it doesn't point toward any exit. 36 minutes. The defense array was still armed. The second craft was still in holding pattern. The footage was still circulating on platforms the regime was in the process of blocking, which would take approximately 3 hours longer than the regime thought it would. And somewhere in a sub-level of a building that didn't appear on any registry, a man who had been doing this long enough to have watched every version of this particular collapse looked at the time remaining on his screen and decided that the math had already been done, and the answer was the answer it always was, which was that the conditions for a different outcome had never quite assembled themselves in the right order. He started preparing for what came after the 37 minutes, because somebody had to. Superman moved at 1,103. Not because the deadline had passed, it hadn't not yet, but because standing still, while someone methodically dismantled every structural assumption of the past 4 years, had become a thing his body refused to continue doing. He crossed the distance between them in under a second, which was fast enough that anyone watching from street level would have seen only the displacement of air, and then 2 figures, one of them already stopped. Topo had not moved to intercept. He had simply extended one arm palm forward, and the force behind that gesture met Superman's momentum the way a cliff face meets a wave, not blocking it so much as making it irrelevant. Superman pushed. The air between his chest and Toppo's palm compressed into something that had no good analogy in standard physics. He could feel his own strength working, finding no purchase the effort going nowhere. The way effort goes nowhere when the thing you're pushing against isn't resisting you, so much as it simply exists at a different order of magnitude. His vision didn't blur. His body didn't fail. He just stopped being able to move forward. 3 seconds. 4. Topo lowered his arm. The compression released. You don't have authority here. His voice was level. It cost him something to keep it that way. Neither do you. Yours expired the moment you decided enforcement was the same as governance. He turned away. Not dismissively, the way you turn away from something that has been addressed and no longer requires your direct attention. Get out of my way. Superman did not get out of the way. He also did not move forward again. He stood where he was and issued a command through his comm channel. Full perimeter activation, all available units, eastern and northern sectors, and received acknowledgement from 7 of the 12 active channels. The other 5 returned static, which was the first indication that something had already changed in the past 90 seconds that his tactical display hadn't caught up to yet. The regime's central coordination hub, occupied the 14th floor of a building that had been requisitioned 4 years ago from a financial services company that no longer existed. The hub ran 23 simultaneous functions: detention authorization, movement tracking, broadcast coordination unit, deployment, surveillance, routing, and 16 others that kept the machinery of a city under managed authority running without visible seams. At 11:04, the hub stopped. Not in a cascade, no warning lights, no system alerts, no dramatic sequence of failures rippling outward. It stopped the way a clock stops when you remove the mechanism that makes time mean something. Every function closed simultaneously. The screens went dark. The clearance queues emptied. The 17 analysts on duty looked at their stations and then at each other. And the room produced the particular silence of people who have just discovered that the thing they were operating was already gone before they noticed. 2 floors below in the building's server architecture, nothing was physically damaged. The hardware was intact. The architecture was intact, whatever Topo had done. And the technical team that would spend the next 6 weeks trying to reconstruct it would never fully agree on what that was. He had removed the operational logic without touching the physical structure. Like taking the words out of a book while leaving the paper. On street level, the first visible consequence was small: a checkpoint on the Northern Transit Corridor lost its authorization feed and went to manual protocol, which meant the 2 soldiers staffing it looked at each other and made a judgment call about what to do with the 11 people currently in processing. They released them. It wasn't a heroic decision. It was the path of least resistance, when the system that told you what to do had stopped telling you anything. By 11:08:47, checkpoints across the city had made similar judgment calls with varying results. Most released. 4 did not, because the soldiers staffing them had internalized the logic of the system well enough that they could run it without the apparatus. This was the part that didn't feel like a victory. Batman had been tracking the hub's status in real time from a relay a mile east. When the shutdown registered across his monitoring feeds, he was already moving not toward the hub, but toward a sub-level 3 blocks from the eastern corridor, where his network maintained what he privately called a last resort architecture. It had taken 8 months to build. It was designed to function as a pressure valve, a set of carefully calibrated capabilities that could, if deployed under specific conditions, destabilize the regime's command structure in a way that would force negotiation. He arrived at the sub-level access point at 11:06 and found Toppo standing in front of the sealed door. The door was still sealed. Toppo hadn't gone through it. "You knew about this location?" "Not a question. I knew you had one. I've been reading the shape of your network's gaps for 2 hours. The places where your people don't go tell you more than the places where they do." Batman looked at the sealed door. 8 months. Designed for a specific worst-case scenario that had never quite arrived because he'd always found another way. "If you destroy it, I'm not going to destroy it. You are." The silence stretched. "What you built in there," Topo continued, "has a casualty radius. You know the number better than I do. You built it knowing the number because you decided the math justified the capability. I'm not here to argue whether you were wrong." He looked at Batman with the patience of someone who has already reached a conclusion and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "I'm here because if you walk away from this building still holding that option, everything I've done today means nothing. The regime loses its machinery. You keep yours. That's not disarmament. That's a shift in advantage. If I give this up," Batman's voice was flat, "and the regime rebuilds, which they will then, and I have nothing left, then you'll have to find a way that doesn't end with a button." Batman looked at him for a long moment. In 20 years of doing this, of building contingencies, maintaining leverage, operating in the space between what was legal and what was necessary, He had developed a comprehensive model of how power worked and what it required. The model was accurate. It had kept him alive and functional through things that should have ended both. It had also, over time, become the thing he was protecting rather than the tool he was using. He knew this. He had known it for a while. Knowing it hadn't changed the math. He pressed his access code into the panel. The door unsealed. He went inside, and 4 minutes later, he came back out, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who has just made a decision they'll spend years second-guessing but cannot honestly say was wrong. If a power vacuum opens up, people die in it. That's not a hypothetical. Vacuums are filled by what depends on what's available to fill them. He stepped back from the door. What you just removed was one of the options. Choose what comes next more carefully. He didn't wait for a response. He walked toward the eastern access, and Batman stood at the threshold of an empty sub-level and did not call after him because there was nothing to call after him that wasn't either a concession or a threat, and he was too tired for either. On the 14th floor of the requisitioned building, one of the analysts had found a window. She was looking out at the city, not searching for anything specific, just looking. And from that height, you could see a significant portion of the eastern district, the harbor beyond it, the sky above both. The containment spheres from the morning were all grounded now. The streets had the texture of streets where something had recently happened and not yet resolved into either normalcy or the next crisis. Her station behind her was dark. The directive queues were empty. The 17 functions the hub had been running were all, as of 4 minutes ago, running nowhere. She had been in this job for 2 years. She had told herself when she took it that she was keeping the machinery functional to prevent something worse. The machinery had been doing what machinery does: processing, authorizing, routing, deploying. She had kept it running. It had kept running. She looked at the dark station and the empty queues and thought about the 31 people who had been released from the checkpoint that morning because a supervisor had been afraid of footage. She thought about the 19 who had been released from preventive detention in the past 2 hours because someone upstairs had finally done the arithmetic on what Toppo was measuring. She thought about the 4 at the harbor. She didn't know what came next. She suspected nobody did. That was new. In 2 years, there had always been a next directive. Superman found Toppo at 1119 in the eastern corridor, standing at the spot he seemed to return to, the way a reference point returns the cracked pavement from the sphere's anchor, the center of the morning's events. The perimeter he had ordered was still nominally active, but 7 of the 12 channels had been running on local judgment for 15 minutes, which meant it was a perimeter in the way that a fence is a perimeter when someone has removed the posts. You took apart 20 years of infrastructure in 20 minutes. The infrastructure of coercion. What was built without it took longer and survived longer. You'll find out which parts those were. People are going to die in what you just created. People were dying in what existed. Toppo looked at him without anger, without satisfaction. The difference is that what existed had a name and a seal and a broadcast frequency. What comes next will have to earn its authority rather than inherit it. Superman's jaw worked. He had given a great deal to build what had just been removed, and the calculus of that, giving the specific cost paid by specific people in exchange for a specific outcome, was not something he could look at directly for very long. This isn't justice. This is destruction with better rhetoric. Your people sent an unlisted team to an armed platform this morning, 2 hours after agreeing to stand down. I watched a 17-year-old miss a medical appointment because a checkpoint couldn't process a travel authorization without a command feed telling it what to do. I watched your broadcast soften language in real time, based on legal exposure." He was quiet for a moment. "You built a system that cannot function without constant direction, because you remove the conditions under which people make independent judgments. That is not order. That is dependency dressed as governance." Superman said nothing. The comm channel in his ear had been producing intermittent static for the past 10 minutes, the sound of a command network running on local initiative and producing inconsistent results. "The secondary weapon system aboard the ship. I'm going to disarm it within the hour. Not because you deserve the safety, because the people below it do." He turned away from Superman for the second time that morning, and this time the distance between them felt larger than the physical space accounted for. "What you do with the time is yours." The broadcast towers across the Eastern District had gone to emergency backup protocol when the hub shut down, a static frequency, no content, just a carrier signal waiting for something to carry. In the absence of a directive, the signal was running the last cached item in its queue, which turned out to be a public service announcement about water conservation that had been uploaded 18 months ago and never cleared. In apartment windows on screens through the speakers mounted to government buildings that had spent 4 years delivering a specific kind of message, the city heard a calm voice explaining how to check a faucet for leaks. Nobody laughed. Nobody cried. Most people just sat with it. The sound of something small and ordinary filling the space, where something large and frightening used to be, and tried to figure out how to feel about the difference. Kent Nelson had 12 minutes. He knew the number precisely because Nabu had given it to him, which was unusual. Nabu did not typically negotiate, he calculated. The calculation this time had produced 12 minutes as the window during which Kent's intervention would cause less disruption to order's long-term configuration than the alternative, which was Toppo proceeding without any structured exit point for the city's most vulnerable population. Nabu had run the numbers and determined that a small contained refuge was preferable to the chaos profile of a complete erasure with no managed exceptions. It was, Kent thought, the most Nabu thing Nabu had ever done. Consent given for the right reasons by the wrong logic. He didn't argue. He had 4 years of practice not arguing with Nabu and approximately 12 minutes of something that felt like agency. He used them. The building he chose was 2 blocks from the Eastern Corridor, a community medical facility that had been operating on skeleton staff since the hub shut down, which meant it still had people in it who couldn't easily leave a ward of children under treatment. 3 surgical cases, mid-recovery, a waiting room, full of people who had been there before the morning's events began and had nowhere safer to go. 41 people in total when he counted. He could move perhaps 22 through what he was about to open, and even that number would cost him everything he had left. He made the calculation the way Kent Nelson made calculations, which was different from how Nabu made them, starting with the children. The passage he opened was not a door in any visual sense. It was a compression of the space between one configuration and another, a 30-second window narrow, requiring people to move through it in single file. He held it with both hands in a way that was not literally his hands, but was the closest physical metaphor for what he was actually doing. And the effort of it produced a low sound at the edge of hearing, like a very large structure settling under an uneven load. A woman came through first, carrying a child against her chest, with the particular grip of someone who has decided that if she falls, the child will not. Behind her, another child, older, walking fast, not looking back. A man on crutches who moved faster than the crutches suggested he should be able to. A medic, still wearing gloves, pulling a patient on a portable stretcher by one handle, another medic at the other end. They had clearly organized themselves in the 40 seconds between Kent's arrival and the passage opening a triage of their own. Made in crisis, probably wrong in some ways, probably right in the ways that mattered. 18 people moved through in 26 seconds. Kent held the passage for the remaining 4 seconds, and watched the faces of the people in the room who were not going to make it through, not because they weren't trying, but because 22 was the number, and the number was already spent. A man near the back wall met his eyes through the closing compression and didn't say anything. He just looked. Kent looked back. The passage closed. Toppo had been on the roof of the medical facility since Kent arrived. He had not been invited. He had positioned himself there because the autonomous defense platform's threat assessment had been running continuously since he'd chosen not to disarm it hours earlier. And he had identified 40 minutes ago, when he told Superman he would disarm it within the hour, that the platform's targeting parameters would flag a significant magical energy signature as a threshold event. He had not disarmed it yet. He had made a calculation of his own. The calculation was this: if he disarmed the platform before Fate acted. Fate would not act because Kent Nelson's 12 minutes were contingent on Nabu's tolerance for disruption, and Nabu's tolerance for disruption was contingent on the platform representing an ongoing threat that a structured exit could partially mitigate. Remove the threat, remove the justification, remove the 12 minutes. He had known this since 10:47. He had not told anyone. He stood on the roof and watched Kent hold the passage open and watched 18 people move through it and watched the passage close, and he did not intervene in any of this because it was the right thing happening. At the cost it was always going to cost, and intervening would have changed the cost without changing the outcome. The platform fired at 1,131 4 seconds after the passage closed. What it fired was not a projectile. It was a termination pulse, the same targeting logic it had used in the harbor, calibrated this time to the specific energy signature it had been tracking since 11:04. The pulse hit the helm of Nabu at the exact moment the helmet was most exposed, when Kent had just released everything he had into the passage and had not yet begun to reconsolidate. The impact was very small. That was the worst part of it, not that it was catastrophic, but that it was efficient. A machine doing exactly what it was built to do in the most minimal way possible, with no interest in the thing it had just ended. Kent Nelson sat down against the wall of the hallway below the roof where Topo was standing, and the helm listed to one side, and he said something that might have been a name or might have been a word in a language older than English. And then he was quiet. Topo came down from the roof. He crouched next to Kent for a moment, not performing grief, not announcing anything, just acknowledging the physical fact of the man on the floor, with the same directness he brought to every other physical fact he had encountered today. The helm had gone dark. The cloak had lost whatever quality had made it more than cloth. Kent Nelson looked like a man who had been very tired for a very long time and had finally been given permission to stop. He tried to do right, not to Kent, who was past hearing, not to anyone in particular. Just said it because it was true, and because true things sometimes need to be stated aloud, when the only other option is silence. He stood up. He looked at the wall where the passage had been. He looked at the door at the far end of the corridor behind which the man near the back wall was probably still standing, still looking at the space where Kent's eyes had been. He did not open the door. Superman arrived at 1,139. He had tracked Kent's energy signature from the moment the passage opened, which meant he had known what was happening and had not intervened. Not because he couldn't reach it in time, but because the passage had been for civilians, and stopping it would have been the kind of decision that he understood now was the kind of decision that had brought them to this particular corridor. He looked at Kent on the floor. He looked at Toppo standing over him. The platform. Still armed. I'll disarm it now. There's nothing left for it to target. The last part landed in the hallway with the weight of a true thing, said at the wrong time, which is to say, exactly the right time. Superman absorbed it without responding. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides in the deliberate way of someone who has made a decision not to use them. He was trying to save people. Yes. And you let the platform fire. I let the platform do what it was built to do because the alternative was 37 fewer people getting through. He looked at Superman without apology and without the pretense that this was comfortable. I ran the numbers. So did Nabu. We arrived at the same answer by completely different methods, which tells you something about the shape of the problem. Superman said nothing for a long time. The corridor was the kind of quiet that corridors become after something has happened in them. Not peaceful, just emptied of whatever had been filling it. 18 people. A long pause. Out of how many? 41 in the building. More in the city. Toppo moved toward the corridor exit. That's what your world offered in 12 minutes. 18. He passed Superman in the corridor without stopping. Superman did not move to block him, which was either restraint or acknowledgement, or both. And the distinction had stopped mattering somewhere in the past 8 hours. Batman found Kent at 11:47. He had already known from his network sensors that the platform had fired. He had already known the target. He stood in the corridor for approximately 30 seconds, looking at the helm and what it was resting against, and then he sat down across from it on the opposite wall, which was not something Bruce Wayne typically did in active situations, but which he did now because sometimes the body makes decisions the mind hasn't finished processing yet. He thought about the 8 months he had spent building the capability he had dismantled 4 hours ago. He thought about the 6 years before that, building other capabilities, each one designed to be the last resort that would make the previous last resort unnecessary. He thought about Kent Nelson, who had spent years trying to act with integrity inside a system that treated integrity as a variable, and who had managed it at the end for exactly 12 minutes. He thought about the man near the back wall. He didn't know who the man was. He knew he was still in the building on the other side of a door at the end of this corridor, in a room with 23 other people who had not been part of the 18. He stayed in the corridor for another minute, which was longer than he could professionally justify. Then he stood up because there was still work to do, and the work did not wait for grief that hadn't finished arriving yet. And he walked toward the building's main exit, and behind him, the helm sat in the corridor in the particular silence of things that have been emptied of their purpose, waiting for someone to decide what to do with them next. Nobody came back for a long time. The sky above Metropolis changed at 12:04. Not in any way that a meteorologist could log or a sensor array could quantify. The light shifted, not dimming exactly, but losing a quality the way afternoon light loses warmth when a cloud crosses the sun. Except there was no cloud, and the change was not in warmth, but in something that didn't have a name in the vocabulary of people who measured light. The birds that had been returning to the Eastern District since the morning's chaos quieted, went quiet again. A radio in an open window 3 blocks from the medical facility cut to static, then silence without the radio being touched. Superman felt it first, which was a function of his range of perception, rather than any particular sensitivity to what it represented. He was standing in the street outside the facility, still processing the conversation in the hallway, when the quality of the air around him changed in a way that his body registered as a threat before his mind had finished identifying it. He looked up. Batman 2 blocks east felt it as a pressure, the specific kind that meant something operating at a frequency beyond the electromagnetic spectrum was nearby and not trying to hide. He had experienced it twice before in his life, both times in contexts he did not enjoy remembering. He stopped moving and did not reach for anything on his belt, because there was nothing on his belt that would be relevant. Topo had already turned. Then the specter did not arrive. Arrival implies movement from one point to another, and whatever the specter was, it did not move through space, the way things that move through space move through it. One moment there was a street and a damaged building and an afternoon that had stopped behaving like an afternoon. The next moment there was also the specter, a figure in the geometry of the scene that had not been accounted for in the previous arrangement. Green-cloaked, white-skinned eyes, carrying light that had no external source. Tall in the way that things are tall, when height is a consequence of nature rather than dimension. It looked at Topo. Topo looked back at it with the expression of someone who has been in the presence of significant authority before and knows that the correct response is neither deference nor challenge. Superman moved forward. The movement was automatic, the muscle memory of a man who, for 4 years, had been the largest power in any room he entered. "You don't have jurisdiction here." Superman moved forward as he spoke. The specter did not look at him. It continued looking at Topo, and the quality of its not looking at Superman was not dismissive, but simply accurate. Superman was not the relevant party in this exchange. "You called." Not a question. The signal was sent before I arrived. Its voice was the kind of voice that does not seem to originate from a throat. "I am not here because you summoned me. I am here because what is being weighed requires a witness at the level of the weight." "Then witness." Superman's jaw was tight. "Whatever you think gives you the authority to pass judgment on an entire world." He used the word "of mine." The specter still not looking at Superman. He said, "My world." He has been saying it for years. That is part of what is being weighed. Superman stopped. Batman's voice came from the edge of the scene controlled flat. "Is there another way?" The specter looked at him then. A small concession to the question, or possibly to the person asking it. There are always other ways. The ways were offered. They were not taken. What remains is not a choice between paths. It is a reckoning with the path that was chosen. That's not an answer. Batman's voice was flat. It is the only accurate one. The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture, the texture of a conclusion that has been arriving for a long time and has finally pulled level with the present moment. I am not the executioner. The specter returned its attention to Topo. I am the verdict. The distinction matters. I know the distinction. Then you know what follows? Yes. Superman took another step forward. His voice was still controlled, but the control was costing him more than it had a minute ago. You're asking him to destroy a world because it failed your standards. Because the people in it couldn't fix 4 years of damage in a single morning. The morning was not the measure. Toppo cut in before the specter could answer. He looked at Superman directly. 6 years was the measure. 6 years, and the answer at every point was more control, more enforcement, more authority concentrated in fewer hands. The morning was a test of whether the trajectory could change. It could not. We were making progress. You released 19 people out of 43 in 2 hours and sent an unlisted team to an armed weapon platform on the same morning you agreed to stand down. Toppo's voice was level. Not angry level in the way of someone reading from a record that has already been closed. That is not a trajectory changing. That is a trajectory demonstrating what it is. Superman had no answer that wasn't a concession or a deflection, and he was too honest for deflection and too proud for concession. So he stood with the gap between them and said nothing. The specter raised one hand, not toward anyone. Toward the city in general, a gesture that encompassed the damaged pavement. The quieted broadcast towers, the hallway where the helm was still sitting, the harbor where 4 people had been pulled from the water that morning. The facility where 23 people were on the other side of a door that hadn't opened. It is witnessed. Then, it was not there. Not gone. Not in the way that a person leaves a room. simply no longer present in the arrangement of the scene in the same way. It had not been present before and then had been. The light returned to its previous quality. The radio in the open window resumed mid-sentence, playing something that had been interrupted and didn't know it. Batman walked to where Toppo was standing. He had been doing this work long enough to know that the moments after a large thing happens are not the moments when large things get said. They are the moments when small, accurate things get said, or nothing gets said at all, and both are legitimate. The people in the facility. Batman stopped beside him. The 23. They'll have time to leave the building. What they do with that time is theirs. Batman absorbed this. It was not comfort, but it was a line, and lines mattered. And the ones who got through, where did fate send them? Somewhere that isn't here. Topo looked at the sky, which was now an ordinary late afternoon sky with nothing unusual about it. Far enough. Batman nodded once. He looked at Superman, who was still standing where he had been, not moving the expression on his face. One that Bruce Wayne had seen before on his own face in mirrors on mornings when he'd had to acknowledge that a decision he'd made had produced consequences he'd understood were possible and had made the decision anyway. He didn't say anything to him. There was nothing useful to say, and usefulness was what he had left. He turned and walked north because there were still 23 people in a building that was going to stop being a building, and someone needed to be there when they came out. Sir, Toppo stood in the street after Batman left, and Superman remained, and the city moved around them in the diminished, careful way it had been moving all day. People who kept their heads down kept their pace, even kept the particular expression of people who had learned that visible emotion in public spaces was a variable that could be used against them. He looked at it, all of it, the street, the windows, the checkpoint marks on the pavement, the broadcast tower in the middle distance that was running on backup protocol and producing nothing, the sky where the ship was still drifting in low orbit, inert, now its purpose concluded. He had run these numbers before. Different world, different names, same shape. A place where the systems meant to protect people had calcified around the people protecting them. And the gap between the two had grown large enough that the system was now primarily self-sustaining rather than functional. And the people inside it had stopped being able to see the gap because they had been inside it for long enough that the gap looked like normal. There was no version of this that ended well. That was not a failure of the plan. It was a feature of the condition. You could have left. Superman's voice came from behind him. After Brainiac, you did what the signal asked. You could have gone. I could have. Why didn't you? Toppo was quiet for a moment. Not because the answer was complicated, but because it deserved to be said precisely. Because leaving would have been a judgment without a record. He stopped walking. A world ends and no one who was there can say what was tried and what wasn't. That matters, not to the outcome, to whatever comes after it. Superman said nothing. The street went on around them, ordinary and damaged, and moving forward in the way that streets move forward when there is nowhere else for them to go. Tomorrow won't come here. He didn't say it to Superman. He didn't say it to the city. He said it the way you state a fact that has been verified and can now be filed, not with satisfaction, not with grief, just with the particular finality of a thing that is true and has been acknowledged as true and no longer needs to be weighed. He turned away from the street. Behind him, Superman stood in the afternoon that was still happening in a city that was still running on the momentum of itself, and looked at the empty space where the Spectre had been and the occupied space where Toppo had been, and tried to find the place where he had made the decision that could have been made differently. He was still looking when the light changed again. The sky above Metropolis changed at 12:04. Not in any way that a meteorologist could log or a sensor array could quantify. The light shifted, not dimming exactly, but losing a quality the way afternoon light loses warmth when a cloud crosses the sun. Except there was no cloud, and the change was not in warmth, but in something that didn't have a name in the vocabulary of people who measured light. The birds that had been returning to the eastern district since the morning's chaos went quiet again. A radio in an open window 3 blocks from the medical facility cut to static, then silence without the radio being touched. Superman felt it first, which was a function of his range of perception rather than any particular sensitivity to what it represented. He was standing in the street outside the facility, still processing the conversation in the hallway, when the quality of the air around him changed in a way that his body registered as a threat before his mind had finished identifying it. He looked up. Batman 2 blocks east felt it as a pressure, the specific kind that meant something operating at a frequency beyond the electromagnetic spectrum was nearby and not trying to hide. He had experienced it twice before in his life, both times in contexts he did not enjoy remembering. He stopped moving and did not reach for anything on his belt because there was nothing on his belt that would be relevant. Topo had already turned. The specter did not arrive. Arrival implies movement from one point to another, and whatever the specter was, it did not move through space, the way things that move through space move through it. One moment there was a street and a damaged building, and an afternoon that had stopped behaving like an afternoon. The next moment, there was also the specter. A figure in the geometry of the scene that had not been accounted for in the previous arrangement. Green-cloaked, white-skinned eyes carrying light that had no external source. Tall in the way that things are tall, when height is a consequence of nature rather than dimension. It looked at Toppo. Topo looked back at it with the expression of someone who has been in the presence of significant authority before and knows that the correct response is neither deference nor challenge. Superman moved forward. The movement was automatic, the muscle memory of a man who, for 4 years, had been the largest power in any room he entered. You don't have jurisdiction here. Superman moved forward as he spoke. The specter did not look at him. It continued looking at Topo, and the quality of its not looking at Superman was not dismissive, but simply accurate. Superman was not the relevant party in this exchange. You called. Not a question. The signal was sent before I arrived. Its voice was the kind of voice that does not seem to originate from a throat. I am not here because you summoned me. I am here because what is being weighed requires a witness at the level of the weight. Then witness. Superman's jaw was tight. Whatever you think gives you the authority to pass judgment on an entire world. He used the word of mine, the specter still not looking at Superman. He said, my world. He has been saying it for years. That is part of what is being weighed. Superman stopped. Batman's voice came from the edge of the scene, controlled flat. Is there another way? The specter looked at him, then a small concession to the question, or possibly to the person asking it. There are always other ways. The ways were offered. They were not taken. What remains is not a choice between paths. It is a reckoning with the path that was chosen. That's not an answer. Batman's voice was flat. It is the only accurate one. The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture, the texture of a conclusion that has been arriving for a long time and has finally pulled level with the present moment. I am not the executioner. The specter returned its attention to Topo. I am the verdict. The distinction matters. I know the distinction. Then you know what follows. Yes. Superman took another step forward. His voice was still controlled, but the control was costing him more, than it had a minute ago. You're asking him to destroy a world because it failed your standards, because the people in it couldn't fix 4 years of damage in a single morning. The morning was not the measure. Toppo cut in before the Spectre could answer. He looked at Superman directly. 6 years was the measure. 6 years, and the answer at every point was more control, more enforcement, more authority concentrated in fewer hands. The morning was a test of whether the trajectory could change. It could not. We were making progress. You released 19 people out of 43 in 2 hours and sent an unlisted team to an armed weapon platform on the same morning you agreed to stand down. Toppo's voice was level, not angry level in the way of someone reading from a record that has already been closed. That is not a trajectory changing. That is a trajectory demonstrating what it is. Superman had no answer that wasn't a concession or a deflection. And he was too honest for deflection and too proud for concession. So he stood with the gap between them and said nothing. The Spectre raised one hand, not toward anyone, toward the city in general, a gesture that encompassed the damaged pavement. The quieted broadcast towers, the hallway where the helm was still sitting, the harbor, where 4 people had been pulled from the water that morning, the facility where 23 people were on the other side of a door that hadn't opened. It is witnessed. Then it was not there. Not gone, not in the way that a person leaves a room. Simply no longer present, in the arrangement of the scene in the same way it had not been present before, and then had been. The light returned to its previous quality. The radio in the open window resumed mid-sentence, playing something that had been interrupted and didn't know it. Batman walked to where Toppo was standing. He had been doing this work long enough to know that the moments after a large thing happens are not the moments when large things get said. They are the moments when small, accurate things get said, or nothing gets said at all, and both are legitimate. The people in the facility. Batman stopped beside him. The 23. They'll have time to leave the building. What they do with that time is theirs. Batman absorbed this. It was not comfort, but it was a line, and lines mattered. And the ones who got through, where did fate send them? Somewhere that isn't here. Toppo looked at the sky, which was now an ordinary late afternoon sky with nothing unusual about it. Far enough. Batman nodded once. He looked at Superman, who was still standing where he had been, not moving the expression on his face, one that Bruce Wayne had seen before on his own face in mirrors on mornings, when he'd had to acknowledge that a decision he'd made had produced consequences he'd understood were possible and had made the decision anyway. He didn't say anything to him. There was nothing useful to say, and usefulness was what he had left. He turned and walked north because there were still 23 people in a building that was going to stop being a building, and someone needed to be there when they came out. Topo stood in the street after Batman left, and Superman remained, and the city moved around them in the diminished, careful way it had been moving all day. People who kept their heads down, kept their pace, even, kept the particular expression of people who had learned that visible emotion in public spaces was a variable that could be used against them. He looked at it. All of it. The street, the windows, the checkpoint marks on the pavement, the broadcast tower in the middle distance that was running on backup protocol and producing nothing, the sky where the ship was still drifting in low orbit, inert, now its purpose concluded. He had run these numbers before. Different world, different names, same shape of place, where the systems meant to protect people had calcified around the people protecting them, and the gap between the two had grown large enough that the system was now primarily self-sustaining, rather than functional. And the people inside it had stopped being able to see the gap because they had been inside it for long enough that the gap looked like normal. There was no version of this that ended well. That was not a failure of the plan. It was a feature of the condition. You could have left. Superman's voice came from behind him. After Brainiac. You did what the signal asked. You could have gone. I could have. Why didn't you? Toppo was quiet for a moment. Not because the answer was complicated, but because it deserved to be said precisely. Because leaving would have been a judgment without a record. He stopped walking. A world ends and no one who was there can say what was tried and what wasn't. That matters, not to the outcome, to whatever comes after it. Superman said nothing. The street went on around them, ordinary and damaged and moving forward in the way that streets move forward when there is nowhere else for them to go. Tomorrow won't come here. He didn't say it to Superman. He didn't say it to the city. He said it the way you state a fact that has been verified and can now be filed not with satisfaction, not with grief, just with the particular finality of a thing that is true and has been acknowledged as true and no longer needs to be weighed. He turned away from the street. Behind him, Superman stood in the afternoon that was still happening, in a city that was still running on the momentum of itself, and looked at the empty space where the Spectre had been and the occupied space where Toppo had been, and tried to find the place where he had made the decision that could have been made differently. He was still looking when the light changed again.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.